May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable to God. Amen.
Amen.
You know, my real sermon is going to be on Genesis. However, before I begin it, the gospel needs a brief response. The good news is the response in the sermon will still only be 6 minutes each. We have in this passage from Matthew's gospel a brief skirmish between the highly ranked Jewish officials of the religion and Jesus over the ritual washing of hands and the food restrictions based on the law of the Torah. The disciples did not wash their hands before eating, and this is where a lot of people get hung up. They probably should. But that's our rules, and we'll get back to that. Now, this is not the hand scrubbing that Fauci recommended to avoid COVID. It's the sort of hand washing you witness when an acolyte or a deacon pours water over the priest's hands before communion service begins. It is symbolic purification. For germ prevention, it's useless, and that is why it's followed by hand sanitizer. At the end of this confrontation with the Jewish leaders, Jesus concludes neither food nor the hand washing before food has anything to do with religious defilement before God. What comes out of our mouths because of the evil and exclusion we carry in our hearts, that defiles us. In the next story, Jesus almost rejects a woman whose culture is foreign to his. She is on her knees and addresses him as a person might in a prayer. She calls him Lord and Son of David, and she pleads with him to free her daughter from demon possession. Then something comes out of Jesus' mouth that sounds like defilement in today's world, where most of us are working so hard to be inclusive. We are in the world that the gospeler could not imagine. Really, we are in a world that our fathers and mothers couldn't imagine. Here, insults and jokes about other people and other genders are not acceptable. We are engaged in monitoring our own speech and calling out others for exclusive comments about women, about LGBTQ persons of other races, and people of foreign cultures. And then in this gospel story, Jesus models the very bad behavior that we're trying to reform. First, Jesus doesn't address the person because she's a woman. His disciples clearly want him to ignore her. And then Jesus does address her, but he compares her people to dogs. And even though the word dog here is the one for the dog kept in the house and not for the mangy mongrels roaming the street, in their world, this is still not acceptable. And maybe you might say it balances out because Jesus just compared his own people to sheep. But that doesn't quite work for me. Now, the story resolves itself seemingly because of the woman's wit. She accepts his insult and turns it on him with a comment that even dogs eat the crumbs under the table. He grants her petition. Her daughter is cured, and he even compliments her on her great faith. So how do we handle a Jesus that does not seem as enlightened as we need him to be? I don't know how you'll do it, but I will share a trick that I use when I come to such an impasse. And here it is. I tell myself that Jesus would have known better, so it must be the gospeler who got it wrong. The gospeler was trying to give us Gentiles a model for a faithful Christian and something that is to come and not really in Jesus' time. So we see someone who is a Gentile that's faithful coming out of our lineage as Gentiles and not the Jewish one. But in the process, he attributed to Jesus his own words and his own thoughts, which he himself might not have quite reformed. The trick is this then. It is never Jesus who gets it wrong, just the author of the gospel. If you attach that to today's lesson, then only the gospeler defiles himself. And the good news is that when he and we make the same mistake in this process of trying to reform our thinking, we can easily be forgiven. Now, the real sermon. Joseph is a vizier of Egypt and the second most powerful man in the known world of his time. He is second only to Pharaoh. Joseph's 10 half-brothers, all Jacob's sons, all older than Joseph, have come to Egypt to buy food for the second year in a row because of the famine in Canaan. As they promised the first time they came, they brought their youngest brother, Benjamin, who had nothing to do with with Joseph's enslavement. Only his half-brothers did. These half-brothers threw Joseph down a dry well when he was about 12. These guys were prepared to let him die of thirst down there when a caravan came by. The thought of making a profit off him, perhaps with a tinge of scruples about killing their half-brother, inspired them to haul him out of that hole and sell him in slavery. Several years had passed. When Joseph went down that well, he had been an insufferable spoiled brat. He learned as a slave that his life depended on making himself useful. Now he is a man of experience, learning, and great faith. Joseph has also been testing his brothers on this visit to determine if these men have also changed for the better. And he has discovered that they have. Joseph has been gratified to learn that those half-brothers never threatened Benjamin's life, and in fact had pledged to lay down their lives for Benjamin's safety on this journey. So Joseph decides to inform them on this second visit that these brothers are indeed in the presence of their long-lost brother. And when he does, they believe him because no one else in the whole world knew what they had done, throw him down a well. Now, the 10 of them are dismayed, and probably because they're thinking of a variety of ways that Joseph could avenge his grievance upon them. Enslavement, torture, imprisonment, and ugly deaths are all possible. The fact that Joseph has been crying, in fact, wailing loud enough that Pharaoh can hear him elsewhere in the palace, is no comfort. The brothers may even believe that this emotional breakdown indicated that he had become unhinged with anger. The truth is, his wailing is because he's overwhelmed with God's graciousness. He has seen his little brother Benjamin, his only full brother, again, and he has learned that his father is alive, and he knows that he will be seeing his father soon, and he is about to have a family again. And he now knows that God sent him ahead of his brothers in order to provide this method of preserving their lives from famine. When Joseph claims and sees their distress written on his on expressions of their faces, he explains that God has turned what seemed a great evil, which these men did foment, into a greater blessing that will soon preserve their lives and prevent further suffering. Joseph, acting for Pharaoh, offers Egypt's land of Goshen, a spot in the Nile Delta, as a shelter for the remnant of the people of Canaan with their herds and flocks, since the famine will not end for 5 more years. And they can stay there as long as they like. And it turns out they stayed for 400 years. It is for this reason that Joseph does not contemplate revenge. Instead, he looks forward to reuniting with his father and right now enjoying Benjamin's company, the only other son born to Jacob's most beloved, Rachel. Perhaps he looks forward to listening to the other brothers describing all that has happened to his family since he last saw them. So what should we take away from this biblical story? I think it is that all of us who have siblings have at one time or another, or even as a matter of habit, been unkind to them. And Joseph teaches us that this is something to outgrow. What can replace unkindness is a respect for the lifelong relationship and respect for persons who are the only people on earth who remember certain important events in our lives and can share a differing perspective on them. Love of our siblings, because they are siblings, is always possible even when there is no other common ground. When we are lucky enough to have common ground with a sibling, even deeper friendships can prevail. Throughout our lives, God may find in our relationships a well-worn path to help us recognize God's blessings in our lives, such as God's scheme to save Jacob and his family from famine. So, 2 sermons later, I'm done. Amen.
Amen.